Do you know that millions of African men, women and children were forced into an unimaginable nightmare, the brutal journey across the Atlantic in the holds of slave ships? The horrors of the transatlantic slave trade are stories that can't be erased, stories of deep sorrow and suffering, of lives stolen and shattered. The people torn from their homes were not just stripped of their freedom, they were stripped of their very humanity. Each day aboard those ships was a new battle for survival, under a set of harsh and unrelenting rules that reduced human beings to mere commodities. These were not rules to protect or guide. They were rules meant to break the spirit and control the bodies of those enslaved. Today, we will walk you through the 30 tragic, inhumane rules that every enslaved African had to obey on the brutal passage known as the Middle Passage. These rules offer a chilling glimpse into the suffering, the loss, and the dehumanization that marked the journey aboard a slave ship. 1. Complete silence. The first rule was one of absolute silence. From the moment they were shackled and placed in the ship's dark, suffocating hold, slaves were expected to remain quiet. Any sound, any whisper could provoke the wrath of the overseers, leading to brutal beatings. Imagine the agony of a mother forced to stay silent while her baby cried for her, powerless to soothe the child without risking punishment. 2. No movement without permission. The enslaved were chained in tight quarters, packed shoulder to shoulder with no room to move. Movement was forbidden unless explicitly ordered by the crew. Even the smallest motion could bring swift, violent reprisal. And so they lay still, enduring the pain and stiffness that came from being confined for days on end. 3. Shackles must never be tampered with. Bound in heavy iron shackles, they were never allowed to remove or tamper with their chains. The metal bit into their skin, creating sores and infections, but the chains stayed on. Freedom, even the freedom to stretch a limb or soothe a wound, was denied. 4. Submit to daily inspections. Each day the captors would inspect the enslaved like cattle. They would check for illness or weakness, discarding those too sick to survive by throwing them overboard. The enslaved had no choice but to submit to this humiliating ritual, knowing their fate lay in the hands of those who saw them as property, not people. 5. No attempts to communicate. Communication, whether verbal or nonverbal, was seen as a threat. The enslaved were forbidden from talking, gesturing, or even making eye contact with each other. Any sign of solidarity could be met with brutal force. They were isolated, cut off not just from their homes, but from each other, left alone in their suffering. 6. Follow the crew's orders without question. The crew demanded absolute obedience. Any hesitation or refusal to follow an order resulted in immediate punishment. The whip became the constant reminder of their powerlessness, and the enslaved had no choice but to endure the endless demands of their captors. 7. Accept starvation rations. Food was scarce, and what little there was, moldy biscuits or gruel, was barely enough to sustain life. They had to accept starvation without complaint. Many grew weak, their bodies wasting away, but they had to eat or risk death by starvation. 8. Endure filth and disease without relief. The hold of the ship was a cesspool of filth and disease. With no sanitation, no fresh air, and no place to relieve themselves, the enslaved were forced to endure the stench of human waste and the spread of diseases such as dysentery, smallpox, and typhus. The filth clung to their bodies and infected their wounds, but there was no relief, no medicine, no clean water, No way to escape the sickening environment. They had to live in this nightmare, praying they would not be the next to fall victim to illness. 9. Remain in cramped quarters. Imagine being crammed into a space so tight that you can't even sit up. The enslaved were packed into tiny, overcrowded compartments below deck, with barely enough room to lie on their backs. There was no comfort, no space to stretch or move. The heat, the suffocation, and the constant pressure of bodies pressed against one another made each moment an agony. 10. No crying out in pain. The pain of shackles cutting into flesh, the bruises from beatings, the sores from lying in one position for days, none of it could be expressed. The enslaved were forbidden from crying out in pain. They had to suffer in silence, with no hope of mercy, as the crew showed no compassion for their torment. 11. No attempts at escape. Escape was a distant dream, but any attempts to flee were met with severe punishment, often death. Slaves who tried to break free from their shackles or leap overboard were brutally beaten or thrown into the sea. The ocean became a grave for those who dared to hope for freedom, their bodies sinking into the depths as a final act of defiance. 12. No aid to the sick or dying. In the hellish conditions of the ship, the sick and dying were left to perish alone. The enslaved were forbidden from helping their ailing companions. Even mothers could not comfort their sick children, as doing so might provoke the wrath of the crew. Instead, they had to watch helplessly as their loved ones succumbed to illness and despair. 13. Obey even in the face of brutality. Brutality was a daily occurrence. The crew routinely beat, whipped or tortured the enslaved to maintain control. The enslaved had to obey even in the face of violence, knowing that resistance would only bring more suffering. They endured the lashes, the broken bones, and the bloody wounds, their bodies scarred by the cruelty of those who held them captive. 14. Accept separation from family. Families were often ripped apart aboard the slave ships. Mothers were separated from children, husbands from wives. The heartbreak of separation was compounded by the knowledge that they would likely never see their loved ones again. They had to bear this loss in silence, their grief just another layer of the suffering they were forced to endure. 15. No rebellion. Any hint of rebellion or resistance was crushed with extreme violence. Those who dared to speak of uprising or disobedience were beaten, starved, or killed in front of the others as a warning. The enslaved were forbidden from even thinking of resistance, knowing that the price of rebellion was death. 16. Submit to forced exercise. To prevent them from becoming too weak to sell, the crew sometimes forced the enslaved to dance or exercise on deck. Under the threat of the whip, they were made to perform, their bodies moving not out of freedom or joy, but out of fear. These moments were cruel mockeries of the life and freedom they had once known. 17. Endure branding and torture. Some of the enslaved were branded like cattle with hot irons, marking them as property of the traders. The pain of the brand seared into their flesh, another cruel reminder of their dehumanization. Torture was also used to extract obedience, whether through flogging, isolation, or starvation. The crew employed every means to break their spirits. 18. No religious or cultural practices. The enslaved were forbidden from practicing their traditional religions or engaging in any cultural rituals. The crew sought to erase their identity, forcing them to abandon the spiritual practices that had given them strength and hope. Their songs, prayers, and stories were silenced, leaving only the crushing weight of despair. 19. Endure forced inspections. Upon nearing port, the enslaved were often inspected by potential buyers, who poked, prodded, and examined them like livestock. They had to submit to these humiliating inspections, knowing that they were being prepared for sale like objects, not human beings. The degradation was complete as they were evaluated solely for their market value. 20. Surrender to despair. Hope was a dangerous thing aboard a slave ship. The enslaved were conditioned to believe that there was no escape, no hope of freedom. The constant beatings, the loss of family, the sickness and death around them, all of it conspired to crush their spirits. Surrendering to despair became a survival mechanism, a way to cope with the overwhelming agony of their existence. 21. No grieving for the dead. Death was a constant companion on the slave ships. When someone died, whether from sickness, starvation, or the violence of the crew, their body was unceremoniously thrown overboard. The living were forbidden from mourning or grieving, forced instead to watch as the sea claimed their dead companions without ceremony or respect. 22. No comforting one another. Even in their suffering, the enslaved were forbidden from offering comfort to each other. Mothers could not hold their children, friends could not offer words of solace, and the dying were left to face their final moments alone. The isolation was complete, stripping away the small acts of humanity that might have eased their pain. 23. Accept the reality of death. For many enslaved Africans, the journey across the Atlantic was a death sentence. They were forced to accept that not all of them would survive. With each passing day, the weak grew weaker and the strong grew tired. The crew made no effort to hide this reality. Death was a constant, and it was clear that they were all expendable. 24. Endure the loss of identity. From the moment they were captured, the enslaved were stripped of their identities. Their names, their cultures, their languages were taken from them. They were forced to endure the loss of self, reduced to nothing more than numbers, to be bought and sold without regard for their humanity. 25. Survive at all costs. Survival became the only goal. The enslaved had to do whatever it took to stay alive, even if that meant enduring unspeakable suffering. For some, the hope of seeing their homeland again, of one day being free, was the only thing that kept them going. For others, survival was an empty victory, as they were left with nothing but the scars of their trauma. 26. Accept the uncertainty of the future. The future was a terrifying unknown. Would they be sold into brutal labor, separated from their remaining family, forced to endure even more suffering? The enslaved had to live with the constant uncertainty of what awaited them once the ship reached its destination, knowing that their fate lay in the hands of the traders and buyers who saw them as mere property. 27. Submit to dehumanization. Every rule, every act of cruelty was designed to strip away their humanity. The enslaved were forced to submit to a system that dehumanized them at every turn, reducing them to commodities for profit. Their value was measured not in their wisdom, strength, or character, but in how much they could be sold for. 28. No rejection of punishment. Punishment was meted out for the smallest infractions. There was no appeal, no defense. The enslaved were expected to accept punishment without resistance, whether it was a beating, starvation, or worse. The crew's cruelty knew no bounds, and even the innocent were subjected to horrific violence. 29. Forced to witness executions. To maintain control, the crew sometimes executed those who rebelled or grew too weak to be of value. The enslaved were forced to witness these executions, the horror of watching their companions murdered serving as a constant reminder of their own precarious situation. 30. No escape from the trauma. Even for those who survived the journey, the trauma was inescapable. The horrors of the slave ships haunted them for the rest of their lives, a permanent scar on their souls. The legacy of this trauma passed down through generations, shaping the history and identity of millions of people. As we reflect on these 30 brutal rules, we must remember that each one represents unimaginable suffering. These were not just rules, they were tools of oppression, designed to break the body, mind and spirit of the enslaved. But even in the face of such cruelty, many survived, holding on to slivers of hope, faith and resilience. The legacy of their strength is a testament to the human spirit's refusal to be completely broken, even in the darkest of times. Thank you for watching Black Stories Untold. Let us remember and honor those who endured this horror, and may we never forget their stories. Please comment where you are watching from, share this story, and subscribe to our channel for more untold truths from our history.